Marta helping us out. Usually at this stage I'm running around with wires, but this is going very well. So welcome to Barnes Philosophy Club. Do come in and have a seat if you've got enough space for the fantastic turnout. I'm Nick Aldridge. I've been chairing the club for a few years now. And we are a public club that meets to talk with philosophers and about philosophers, which we're going to do some of today, and to discuss a wide variety of philosophical issues of all sorts and promote a philosophical and thoughtful approach to everyday life. All levels of philosophical knowledge are welcome. You don't need any background knowledge to attend. We are supported, though, by the Royal Institute of Philosophy, so we're very grand, as well as by the OSO Arts Centre, who are incredibly helpful in putting on this venue and lots of support for us. There's no charge to attend meetings. For those of you who want to support the club, you can make a donation when you book a ticket. We also now have donations set up on the OSO donate page. And if you would like one, you'll get a copy of our book, What Counts as Philosophy. So let me know if you've made a donation and would like a book. Come and see me afterwards. Just a reminder, particularly for those of you who are online, we are recording. So please put yourself on mute and off camera until the Q&A. We have a really good turnout in person today, so we will probably focus on questions in the room. Thanks everyone for coming in person, and if you'd like to stay for a drink and a quick chat afterwards, please do so. I think we might persuade our speaker to stay for a drink afterwards. That's logically possible. It's not impossible. So on to our topic for the season. We very loosely follow the academic year, I guess. So this is the first talk of our year. And we've picked a theme, philosophy and modern life. So we've got a really quite wide range of topics. We're covering philosophy of humour and flirting before we get on to artificial intelligence. And then I think Robin and I are planning to do a talk at some stage as well. So we'll see how that goes. But tonight we have Peter Cave. I'm delighted to welcome Peter. He read philosophy at UCL and King's College, Cambridge. He's held lectureships in philosophy at UCL and at the University of Khartoum, Sudan, as well as City University. He was an associate lecturer for many, many years, it says in your biography, at the Open University, I'm not being rude, and New York University in London. He's also a principal examiner for the Chartered Insurance Institute, if anyone needs any of that done. So Peter will be talking today about his book, and you'll have a sheet of paper near you, hopefully, about it. How to Think Like a Philosopher, Scholars, Dreamers and Sages Who Can Teach Us How to Live. Just to explain a little bit, I've been reading through the book, and Peter talks about how some of the, or many of the great philosophers of history lived and thought, what they thought about and why they thought it. And it's a really fun, accessible introduction to philosophers. If you've ever started to read Wittgenstein or Kierkegaard or Schopenhauer or Kant and thought, this would be great, but I'd rather have it in a fun way in 6 pages, then this is the perfect book for you. So do consider buying it. And Peter will talk about what from their work might give meaning to our lives. Does reality tell us how we ought to live? And what is reality? So hopefully quite a wide-ranging 40 minutes or so for Peter. And I'll do a little bit afterwards about some of the upcoming talks and how to book on. So please welcome to the lectern, Peter Cave.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Nick. I last came here about 10 years ago when the distance between Barnes railway station and this centre wasn't so far. So maybe that manifests my age or the lack of signs at Barnes. But I'm pleased to be invited here. Before I was invited by Paul Fletcher, who really ensured that Barnes railway station was so much nearer to here than Nick has managed to do. Also, my hearty thanks to Marta for saving Nick from being surrounded in cables, apparently. Mind you, it might be interesting to see what you're like surrounded by cables. I was also pleased to hear that Nick said that it wasn't necessary to have any knowledge of philosophy amongst the audience, but that also applies to some of the speakers, and that includes me these days. If you ever get to my age, you find the memory starts fading away, and it's all too much. So I might well make many accidental mistakes as well as few deliberate mistakes. I was also somewhat surprised to hear that I'm meant to be talking about the nature of reality and the nature about modern life, how to deal with modern life and the nature of ethics and so forth. So many things you mentioned there, Nick, whereas I should just briefly allude to a few comments, with, I hasten to say, I like to think humility. So one thing I like the idea of is that we all go away from this talk remembering there's a lot of sense in humility when we think we're going to engage in arguments and he's right or he's wrong. Let's adopt a little bit of humbleness about all of this. I have to say that because then it means you can't attack me too much, because I said all along, I'm humble. So leave me in peace. This is the book which we are advertising here, but which has been the excuse for Barnes Philosophy Society to invite me to give this talk. And it does cover a wide range of topics, as Nick has alluded to. I'm not sure about leaving that dangling preposition, so I shall avoid doing that in future. Right, what's going on? Well, I did quip to Nick that maybe this is my swan song, because as one does get older, trekking from railway stations and so forth hits me more. Not that I'll keep on mentioning that throughout the talk, and so hence I thought I'll show the swan. But I would imagine I might manage a few more swan song comments. I've already done something wrong, apparently. But humility comes to the fore. The swan is also relevant because some of you will know that Socrates likened himself to a gadfly, he likened himself to a stingray. He also likened himself, though, to a swan when he was about to be having to drink the hemlock, because he thought people are saying, I'm singing like the swan song, I'm really very depressed, I don't want to go to death and so forth. Where Socrates, in fact, believed that through his death, he would end up having some sort of afterlife in association with the forms of beauty and truth and so forth. Or maybe that's Plato's interpretation of Socrates. But certainly Socrates looked forward to death, allegedly. And indeed, Socrates said that the whole of philosophy can in fact be perceived as practicing being dead or dying. Some of you may be unaware of that, but you can see maybe the reason Socrates and Plato would make those claims is that philosophy likes to think things through a lot. They like not to be too distracted by the immediacies of everyday life, be they the yearning for another glass of water or the yearning for sex or food. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of Russell Brand now, aren't I? Sorry, I got confused. I won't get involved in that, not right now. My book, though, I like to think many things which aren't true, but I like to think it would encourage people who happen to dip into it to think that you can appreciate some philosophy without having to enter the world of abstraction or erudition or become a lecturer in universities. I think philosophy should, at its heart, be accessible to all thinking human beings, and that's the importance of it, rather than thinking it's a little career move in a university or college. This is a comment about swans, though, from Socrates. Swans, when they sense that it's necessary that they die, sing in the interval before death most beautifully. Well, Socrates, I think, would recognize he didn't sing beautifully, but he would think he was actually raising important issues to think about the world. Men, because of their own fear of death, slander the swans. They say that the swans lament their death, singing because of pain. Socrates was exactly the opposite. He thought you could actually look forward to your non-existence on this mortal coil. We shall come back to some points about that in a moment. My main theme, though, is really a quip which is often associated with Bertrand Russell, but I'm sure many other philosophers said it before Bertrand Russell. Many people would rather die than think, and that is what they do. The whole idea of this evening really is to encourage us all to think, to think. My book tries to encourage that by not being very abstract or very serious at points, but by trying to remind people you can enjoy thinking. And so inside the book, you'll find comments such as philosophy being something with a difference. So it's Jean-Paul Sartre. He got very concerned about nothingness, about non-existence. Here's a famous quip about Sartre. Sartre in the early 20th century, philosophy in the 20th century. May I get you something to drink, Monsieur Sartre, says a waiter. Yes, please, a coffee with sugar, no cream. The waiter goes away and then he returns looking very worried. Oh, I'm terribly sorry, monsieur, we are out of cream. How about with no milk? And if you start reading Sartre, and we'll come on to this a little later on, then you can see the importance of that quip, the idea about talking about things which do not exist. Another example, just I hope to amuse you a little, is most people know about Descartes here, I'm sure, but they may not know that rumors were that Descartes built a beautiful mechanical doll named after his daughter Francine, his illegitimate daughter Francine, and took her around with him even to bed, said they scurrilously. Probably wasn't true, but people thought at that time, some thinkers thought at that time, Descartes, although he talked about the soul, really didn't believe in it. He was a materialist. And so we want to spread rumors against the materialists. Obviously, I won't be able to talk about all these philosophers this evening. That would be a relief to all of us because we wouldn't want to go on forever and ever and ever. That will become another topic. But in the book, I do mention various philosophers. So obviously there's Plato here, as you can see, and Immanuel Kant. Kant has this great austere image, but in fact, Kant as a young man was something of a dandy, as you'll discover. Of course, we cannot really discuss philosophy without the great Ludwig Wittgenstein. Ah, Wittgenstein, I used to say when I taught philosophy at the Open University. Wittgenstein. He, of course, had the great advantage of a wonderful name, Wittgenstein, Ludwig. It sounds so grand, but I am a supporter of Wittgenstein. Søren Kierkegaard, some of you, I'm sure many of you have heard of him. He really is worth dipping into if you want to have a feeling about how you should run your life, how you should try to cope with the everyday world around you. And inevitably, we have Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche, as many of you know, has a bad time being associated with Nazism and Hitler. In fact, that's grossly unfair on Nietzsche. It probably all goes down to his rather odd sister, when Nietzsche was classified as insane and was indeed in a lunatic asylum. I do remember many years ago, at my age, most things I remember many years ago. I don't remember what happened yesterday, but many years ago on a Channel 4 program about Nietzsche, I heard some postmodernists say, Nietzsche had such troubling thoughts. They sent him mad and he went into the lunatic asylum. He did have troubling thoughts, but it wasn't those that sent him mad. He caught syphilis, and that's what led him into the asylum. Maybe that then led to the troubling thoughts. To try to show that you can engage in philosophy without dealing with directly thought of philosophers, I also make reference to Sappho, not purely to try to attract the public, but also because I think Sappho says some interesting things about love and sexual desire. But I'm not getting back to Russell Brand. And Lewis Carroll, I hope to make some comments about him. He was known, of course, as a great mathematician and the writer of Alice in Wonderland, but he also was a very important philosopher on the fringes. So there we have Alice and Cheryl Bickerton, apparently, over Alice, on this version. And Iris Murdoch, again, is a philosopher in the sense that philosophers know of her as a philosopher, but most people outside of philosophy think of her as a novelist. And so there's some interesting points by Iris Murdoch. And we have Sartre and de Beauvoir, of course, but a philosopher I knew very little about until Bloomsbury persuaded me to write this book is Simone Weil. Simone Weil is an intriguing philosopher with a lot of religion behind her, but also a very disturbed and disturbing philosopher. And so I'd strongly recommend you to start reading some Simone Weil if you are interested in a rather different account of how to deal with the world. People tended to think that in order for her to be identified with the oppressed, she more or less starved herself to death. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but undoubtedly she had a very fragile life in many ways. And one of my favorites is Samuel Beckett. So these are just some examples of how I try to explain that some thinkers or writers whom you wouldn't merely think of as being philosophers, in fact, have lots of philosophy going on behind the scenes. As I said at the beginning, though, really I'm concerned about thinking philosophically, and I stress the thinking through Bertrand Russell. Rather than dying, let's think rather than die. So there's a question about what ought we to think about. Lots of issues, Nick has raised them about the nature of reality. We could talk about the nature of numbers. I thought I mentioned some points about the nature of what does not exist, coming back to Sartre. So that's going to be one area for this evening. Another area with thinking is how should we do the thinking? Well, it's easy to say we should do it rationally, but what are the problems in doing something rationally? So I'll say a little bit about reasoning. When Bertrand Russell said people rather die than think, and that's what they do, he's emphasizing the importance of thinking, but it's not just thinking randomly. It's not just thinking badly. You need to recognize that you ought to be thinking with some form of rationality to it, and also with some suitable end in view. It's not very good to be a great thinker if you're thinking what's the best way to kill all philosophers. Well, you may have arguments about that. And the third area would be the aim about being. What aim should we have as human beings? So those are the three areas which I'd like to touch on. Not sure why I said I would like to touch on. Those are three areas which I intend to touch on. But who knows? As a friend of mine who's even older than me, he said, I'll see you next week unless I am called. He's a very religious man. So I may be called. Who can tell? But so long as it's a quick calling, I don't desperately mind. But beware when people say we're calling you. So thinking about what does not exist. So this is the area about what are we thinking about, and this particular topic about items which do not exist. The first think I have is the Taoist thinker Lao Tzu, and he clearly gets into a muddle about non-existence, but then we all should get into that muddle because it is very muddling. The one I hang most of this on are people such as Parmenides, I missed out on Ian Parmenides, and Zeno. And that might lead us to think about people who no longer exist, because they are non-existent now, or even people who are yet to be. Here's Parmenides, though. Parmenides writes about the goddess. The goddess is leading you, showing you different paths. And the goddess is telling you, well, there's this one, that a thing is. That is impossible for it not to be. That's the path of persuasion or of truth. So the goddess is saying that the path you need to follow if you're trying to achieve the truth is a path in which you cannot talk about that which is not. The other path, that a thing is not, and that there is a requirement that it should not be, this I declare is an altogether indiscernible track. You can neither know what is not, that's impossible, nor point it out. So there, going back to the 6th century ancient Greek philosophy leading to the 5th century, is a big issue about how can we manage to point to, talk about, think about things which do not exist. It's far more difficult a problem than just saying how can we talk about unicorns, or if you're atheist about God, because sometimes people say, well, when you're talking about unicorns, you're talking about the ideas which we have of a unicorn. I think that's wrong. There's a difference between the idea of a unicorn and a unicorn. The idea of a unicorn does exist, but a unicorn does not exist, as far as we know. So we should always distinguish between the idea of something and the thing which you have an idea of. Arguably, that's what goes wrong with some arguments to try to show that God must exist, because they slide from we have the idea of God to there is therefore a God. But it's a more important issue than just that, because once you think about Parmenides, he'll be saying, so how can you think about the past? Because items in the past no longer exist, or that they were in the past no longer exist. How can you think about the future? That also doesn't yet exist. It has many ramifications. How can you think about one thing changing and becoming another thing, because that thing which has changed no longer exists? So how did we think about it? It gets very, very complicated, but it's not something which is just stuck there in the 6th century BC. It's something which philosophers even today still anguish about. How can we think about, talk about what does not exist? You may have encountered this in one simple way. Some of you will know about Achilles and the tortoise, maybe. Everyone should know about Achilles and the tortoise, unless you don't. Some say yes, some say no. But this is by Zeno, who was a supporter of Parmenides. And it's a very nice picturesque story about Achilles is the fastest runner in Athens. The tortoise is a regular sort of tortoise, a bit lazy, but he certainly doesn't run as fast as Achilles. And they decide to have a race. There's a big lettuce leaf at the finishing line to give an incentive to the tortoise. And the tortoise is given a head start, well, maybe many head starts. So the tortoise is ahead, he's got that success, and Achilles is behind. And then you have the starting pistol going, so to speak, and they start running. And Zeno's argument is very, very simple. He says before Achilles can overtake the tortoise, he's got to catch up to where the tortoise is at any point. And so, of course, when Achilles has got to the first position for the tortoise, however slow he is, will have moved on a little bit. And so now, for Achilles to overtake the tortoise, he's got to get to where the tortoise is now. But of course, by the time he does that, then the tortoise will have gone on a little further, and then a little further. And so says Zeno, it's impossible for Achilles to catch a tortoise. And with other arguments, he therefore shows, he thinks, that motion is impossible. There is a philosopher without much humility, you may think. He's sure his reasoning is so good that the world of change must be an illusion, whereas more modest philosophers of today will say, no, there is a lot of changing going on, so we must have made a mistake in our reasoning. I have some sympathy for Zeno, though, not least because I know many smug mathematicians, dare I use the word smug mathematicians? I look up to mathematicians normally, and many smug mathematically inclined philosophers say, oh, mathematics have sorted out. There's no problem about having an infinite convergent series, so we can work out when Achilles gets to the tortoise. But Zeno is still pushing home this problem about there's an infinite number of runs to be done. Infinite means endless, and so how can an endless series be ended? That is something very important, and some philosophers still wonder how that works. And that derives from this concern about motion and change, and that derives from the idea about talking what does not exist. That's one big area, and I think if you have some interest in paradoxes and haven't yet heard it, I do recommend that you start looking up Zeno's paradoxes. That's one of 4. That's the most colourful one. Here we have Alice in Wonderland, and this is a more accessible way of making the point because it's funny. Well, I find it funny, but then I find the whole of life funny and despairing and tragic at the same time, really. Especially when I look in the mirror, that's always tragic now. There's a lift I often go into, and it's got all these mirrors all the way around. I think, why can't they have curtains so you could draw it and close it off? It's very tragic. But some of you will know Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. For thousands of years, I've recommended those books to my students of philosophy as being great and entertaining philosophy books to read. In Through the Looking Glass, you have the White King chatting to Alice, and the White King says to Alice, whom do you see on the road? In fact, it's written as who do you see on the road, but I believe it should be whom. I like the impernicity of the grammar, but not when I'm speaking. Whom do you see on the road? Alice says, I see nobody. Nobody. Ah, says the king, to be able to see nobody, and from this distance too. Clearly, the king is thinking of nobody as a somebody. A little later on, the messenger arrives, and the king says, "Whom did you pass on the road?" "Nobody," says the messenger. "Ah, so nobody walks more slowly than you do." "What?" says the messenger. "I'm sure I walk faster than anybody," and so forth. You can see the confusions which are being got in because of thinking of a non-existent entity, in this case, nobody. Bertrand Russell and other philosophers can sort that out linguistically, but nonetheless, one may bear in mind that there is this issue about how you can talk about what does not exist. Lewis Carroll, Charles Dodgson was writing in the 19th century, but the problem was still lurking there, even though it was originated in the 6th century BC with Parmenides, and indeed with Lao Tzu, who was earlier, maybe, arguably. A more recent example still is, some of you will know of Wittgenstein at Cambridge and Bertrand Russell at Cambridge. Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century was recognized as a great philosopher of mathematics, a very important figure. At that time, Wittgenstein, much younger person, was up in Manchester, and he had heard about Russell on mathematics. And so Wittgenstein, from an incredibly wealthy Austrian family and with a great degree of arrogance and confidence, just turned up on Bertrand Russell in Cambridge, basically knocked on his door and very roughly said, "Am I a fool? Am I a genius?" Which Russell thought about it. And he did end up initially thinking he was a genius. But Russell relates an early example when he's saying that, you see, Ludwig Wittgenstein, he actually insisted that it's not true to say there is not an hippopotamus in this room. It's not true to say there's no hippopotamus in this room, or there's no elephant in this room, and so forth. And Russell said, "Well, I pretended to look under the desks, I pretended to look under the chairs. See, Ludwig, there's no hippopotamus here. Wittgenstein, there's no hippopotamus here." But still, he insisted that you couldn't say truthfully there was no hippopotamus in the room. And that, again, is going back to the old problem I mentioned earlier about how can you talk about things which do not exist. If it's true that there's no hippopotamus in the room, then how is that distinguished from the other truth? There's no elephant in the room, or there's no porcupine in the room, and so forth. Wittgenstein was raising a big problem again about how can you manage to talk about things which are not there, which do not exist. And as I said, that does seem to be a problem which can generate these difficulties. It reminds me that, I'm going slightly off target, but Elizabeth Anscombe, the great Wittgensteinian scholar, she was a close friend of Wittgenstein. She took ages to be persuaded that Wittgenstein was a homosexual. She was a really traditional Catholic. She thought, "Oh no, he couldn't possibly be," when the information first came out. But Anscombe, I knew her slightly when I was at King's. Elizabeth Anscombe, this very committed convert Catholic, very bedraggled, always scratching her head, very thoughtful, anguishing all the time. And she ran the postgraduate seminars with Bernard Williams, who was a very suave, sophisticated, atheistic philosopher, very urbane, man of the world. So it was a very strange combination. But one example I always remember from Anscombe was, I remember picking up a wrapper which had a chocolate in it, and on the wrapper it said fruit or nut. And Anscombe went on and on about this, saying, I could understand how it could be fruit chocolate. I could understand how it could be nut chocolate. I could understand how it could be fruit and nut chocolate. But what in the world makes it fruit or nut chocolate? That's the level of linguistic philosophy going on at the time. But I have great sympathy with that. If you are trying to understand the nature of reality and how we manage to talk about it, there are these questions about these disjunctions, these ors, how they relate to the world. Obviously, there's ways of trying to solve it. And the big problem I mentioned is how we talk about things which do not exist. Hence, I had the quip about Sartre early on, because Sartre has this concern about how we think about how we can deal with nothingness, not least because he thought at heart we are nothing. We may come back to that shortly. I mentioned there are other areas where you may think about non-existence. One of my philosophers is Epicurus with Lucretius. And they famously said, when death is there, we are not. When we are there, death is not. Hence, you have nothing to fear about death. Because whilst you're around, you haven't got death. But when death is there, you no longer exist. So how can it possibly affect you? That does then raise the thought, though, about why are we concerned about the deceased? Obviously, some of you may well be committed religious individuals and you think there are afterlives, but if you are straightforward atheists over these matters, as I tend to be, then why should we worry about it? We may be upset to have lost somebody who owes us some money, or we may have been upset to have lost somebody who always buys us lots of drinks. But why should we be upset for them because they no longer do exist? There's been a debate for some centuries, I guess, but certainly some decades, about whether that's a fair comment to make. And some of us would be inclined to say, you can still even harm somebody if they no longer exist, e.g. by ruining their reputation. True, they don't know about it. That's undoubtedly true. But nonetheless, isn't somebody more than the confines of their physical body and their mentality? It is not a person more than that, but also their interests, how they're treated and so forth. And so if you start kicking somebody's skull around once they're dead, or start disobeying the terms of their will, are you not in fact harming them, even though they don't know about it? I recognize you may well be harming relatives. Relatives may be upset for those reasons, but the question is, are you harming the deceased, the non-existent person? And some of us would argue you are, through e.g. ruining their reputation. There's a similar problem, of course, for those individuals who do not yet exist. Is, say, the woman who is about to conceive harming the future child because she's taken lots of drugs or starting to smoke a lot? In other words, how can you deal with these issues, big issues about the non-existence at the beginning, before life, and non-existence at the end, after life? I tend to think those are more accessible concerns about non-existence than the ones I was talking about with the hippopotamus under the table, or about Achilles and the tortoise. But they do interrelate if you think about it. And they also interrelate if you don't think about it, I should add. I'm hoping that's about a third of the time.
Good more than that. We've probably had about
Half?
2/3.
Oh, I'll speed up now. There's another interesting point which I relate to, namely the prey to the other. Jean-Paul Sartre thought that you can always change your life. You always have scope to reinterpret your life, for others to see you in a different way. But of course, once you are dead, that's it. You are prey to the other. There's nothing more you can do. That idea of interpretation also reminds me of something Kierkegaard pointed out. Kierkegaard tells a little story about him against himself, saying, yes, I do remember a new shop opened up near me. There was a laundry. It said, bring your washing here. And so I rushed back home. I collected up all my dirty washing. I went back to the shop. And then I realized it was a shop that sold signs, e.g. the sign, bring your washing here. So that's very important to get the correct interpretation of what's going on in your life. And that relates to Sartre, of course. That also reminds me, in the 1980s, I think, there was a big celebration of Sartre in Paris. Sartre was a chain smoker. He was always seen with a cigarette, but the photographs were retouched. Namely, the cigarettes were always touched out of the photographs. So there he was prey to the other on his death. A form of cancellation or censorship, which I disapprove, as you might well imagine. I mentioned the yet to be, and that will take us to the issue of our I, but I'll move on a little more swiftly. Now I was talking about what about. How should we be thinking about these things? How should we engage with rationality? Well, the great philosopher here is the 18th century Enlightenment philosopher, as he's called, David Hume. I'm sure many of you recognize David Hume, a wonderful guy, deceased though, but we still ought to respect his reputation. He was often known as a great infidel because he howled to his atheism throughout, and yet the French thought of him as the good David Hume. And one of his most important comments is a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. So if we are going to engage in thinking and reasoning, we should have respect for the evidence. And Hume can use that, of course, to cast doubt upon lots of religious belief, in particular beliefs in miracles. One of his famous articles is to say, which is more likely, that the testimony, the reports of a miracle, are in some way mistaken, deliberately or just by accident, or that it really is true, that something incredibly unlikely happened. Well, a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. So as far as Hume can say, you should always dismiss the miracle and think it's a misreportage or misperception in some way. He did allow the possibility that that may not be true, but he said, so far, I haven't experienced any convincing example. Some of you may well be aware that James Boswell, who told the biography of Samuel Johnson, I mean that? Yes. Boswell heard that Hume was seriously ill from bowel cancer, in fact, it turned out, and Boswell knew that Hume was a great atheist, and so Boswell rushed up to Edinburgh to sit by the deathbed, hoping to hear David Hume would recant and be committed to some version of Christianity. And Boswell came away very gloomy, saying he didn't recant at all. He kept to his atheist to the bitter end, which many of us are pleased about. So that's very good about Hume. It does remind me of a story about W.C. Fields, the American comedian. And W.C. Fields was a well-known atheist, and yet when he was very elderly and ill, people went to his bedside and saw him reading the Bible and saying, what's happening? Are you being converted now? Are you recanting? And so on. And Fields said, no, just looking for loopholes. These quips are things which I think will make life worth living. Most things don't. Hume also drew attention to how we reason on the basis of evidence, and that often reminds me of this cartoon I saw on a birthday card some years ago. Here's a cat with a glass of wine, or half a glass of wine, almost empty glass of wine. I wonder if this will bounce. Let's try it out. Presumably it didn't. Well, maybe this one will. In other words, to what extent should you take the past as a guide for the future? And obviously it's a matter of which bits of the past you do take as a guide, but Hume would make the point that you've got no way in which logic or in which evidence, experience can tell you to think the past is a good guide to the future. You just have to accept that it is in many cases. You can do no other. Sometimes it surprised me over the years when one was talking about knowledge and whether you can have knowledge of the future, students would often say, well, you can't know anything about the future. To which, does anybody really believe that? I know very, very well, and you all know very, very well, that in the next 30 seconds, I will not turn into an elephant. We just know this. We should acknowledge we know this instead of thinking, oh, we can't possibly know anything about the future. We know lots of things about the future. And of course, there's many things we don't know about the future. It's logically possible that Sir Braverman may resign tonight. Sadly, I think it's unlikely, but I don't know that. But I do know this will not turn into a hippopotamus, or I will not turn into an elephant. There's also another problem, but I'm aware of time, and this is just a very quick reference on to Buridan's ass. Reasoning again, Buridan was the ass, the donkey of reason, and he found two bundles of hay, one to the left, one to the right, and they're equally succulent, same size, same distance away from him, say one's to the left, one's to the right. And he can't choose between them. He must have a reason to choose one rather than the other. But this one's just the same as this one, and this one's just the same as that one. He's got no preference for right over left or left over right. And so the tale is he dies of starvation. You should be very sad about this. But there's an issue there about how can reason explain, in all cases, what it is that we do or ought to do. There's a sound there. Spinoza, that's Spinoza. Spinoza thought that just shows what a stupid ass he was. And man isn't as stupid as that. Hume then puts reason in its place in various ways, and over what you should aim at, Hume very much puts reason in its place. Hume thinks reason cannot tell your aims in life. It can tell you the best way to achieve what it is that you aim at, but it can't actually determine those aims. Reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. The famous quote, "It is not contrary to reason to prefer the destruction of the whole world to the scratching of my finger." Hume then is saying you can't, reason alone will not tell you what you should be aiming at, whether you should be aiming at happiness or the glory of mankind or greenness or global warming or against global warming. You have feelings about those things, but then reason can tell you the best way to achieve what it is that you aim at. That was a very quick survey about how you do the thinking, and this last little bit will arguably be even quicker then, about what you should aim at. How does it relate to reason? I've already alluded to the fact that the great Socrates said the unexamined life is not worth living. So one thing which many people as philosophers would say, you really do need to reflect on your lives, to think about whether you are actually leading a life which you ought to lead. An example I often use is people often say, well, the only thing that matters is happiness or pleasure. That's a common comment made by so many people. And I nick this example indirectly from Plato, because using Plato's idea, if pleasure is the only thing that you value, then the answer is very simple. Buy some itching powder and a back scratcher. Sprinkle over the powder, itch, scratch, great pleasure. Itch and scratch is great pleasure. But would that be a good human life? Obviously not. Nietzsche makes a similar comment. If all that matters is pleasure, then why not tell each other jokes all the time, so you have a life of laughter and pleasure? Those would not be good lives to live, Nietzsche would say, and certainly Plato and Socrates would say. John Stuart Mill, who is often castigated as a utilitarian, saying all he's concerned about is happiness. Well, yes, he is, but not quite in that way. John Stuart Mill would say that happiness is more than pleasure. If you want happiness, think of it in terms of wanting a flourishing life. What is it for a human being to flourish? Well, it's not just having pleasures, it's having friendships, having a sense of nobility, a sense of respect for oneself, and so forth. There's a whole mishmash of concerns. So I would defend John Stuart Mill, because normally he's attacked as, oh, it's just a utilitarian, thinking pleasure is all that matters. There's a nice quip here to do with Simone de Beauvoir and Simone Weil. I mentioned Simone Weil a little earlier. This is in the early 20th century. Simone de Beauvoir was talking about the goal is for people in their lives to find meaning for their existence. Simone Weil's cutting reply was, it's easy to see you're never gone hungry. I think it's very important if you start thinking about what's valuable in life to recognize all those people in the universe right now who are suffering hunger and much, much worse than that. I shall make all of us feel very guilty in a moment, I hope, but sadly I don't do enough about it. That's why I often talk about the need to muddle through. I have no idea why 10 has appeared on the screen. When I write about these things, I think it's a mistake to believe that philosophers or indeed politicians or indeed theologians can give you clear, concise arguments. In most cases, it's very grey and iffy. I tell of the land of justice in my Myths book, in which, in fact, the society was so keen on justice that they'd ensure that everybody had equal opportunities. We pay lip service to that, but no one really believes it, because you still want some people to have sufficient money to send their children to have special tuition in Paris for their French. And those are people who did that. I mean, you certainly want to have a nice house, even though you know that will help your children to flourish, whereas lots of people on very, very grubby council estates will not have that benefit. So all the way along the line, we are not really committed to equal opportunities, and same in many other ways. But I could go into more examples if you wanted. There's a great conflict about liberty and nannying. I notice many people on the right wing in the Daily Telegraph will normally object to the nannying state, How dare we have a state that dares to tell us it's good not to eat so much sugary items or so many salt-filled crisps and so forth? How dare they tell us that? Well, of course, they don't object, though, to the liberty of corporations to advertise these products and manipulate your desires. So there's an hypocrisy or inconsistency there. I think then one should make use of the old-fashioned term virtue, and recognize there's lots to a life, far more than these rather glib comments like a friend of mine, the glory of liberty. Well, there's not much to the glory of liberty if you can't actually afford, you don't have any money in order to exercise your liberty. You need the ability to exercise the liberty, not just the glory of liberty. Iris Murdoch actually wrote that she thought freedom, liberty was the key thing for everybody to have. Then she felt I must spread it over to virtue, but then she began to suspect, and she ended up talking about the need to overcome poverty, to feed the hungry. That's another advertisement for when I go far more into that. But I'll speed through then. I even speed through that because I know you want me to come towards the end. One disturbing thought, I said I'd give you a disturbing thought, then I'll just summarize with a few very quick thoughts. Nietzsche follows an old and ancient aphorism, all things conspire. We are all interlinked. And we are. Think of the items which you buy. Think of your mobile phones. They've got batteries in which have got cobalt in, which result from some kids in various parts of Africa scraping away for next to nothing to scrape out the cobalt. Goes via China and so forth. So all things conspire. And Nietzsche tells of the greatest weight. This is the eternal recurrence. He says, what if one night a demon steals into your bedroom and tells you that this life which you are leading, you're going to have to lead again and again, eternally, in exactly the same way. No differences at all. He goes into more detail about that. And then he says, how well disposed could you be to your life to welcome that idea of an eternity of it exactly the same? Or would you not fall to the ground and gnash your teeth in horror? I'd go for the gnashing of teeth in horror. It's a nonsense idea, but it's an idea which often makes us start focusing about how pleased can we be with our lives, particularly given how we are enmeshed with all this suffering around us, which is probably what drove Nietzsche mad. And so that's why in various ways, some philosophers, we come back to Wittgenstein and go back to Lao Tzu, would say that in a sense, you want to understand life, probably the best way is to lose yourself out of life. And Schopenhauer and others would say, lose yourself in music. I'm not so sure if I lose myself in some of the rap music I hear around me these days, but I can lose myself in certain music, even the Pet Shop Boys on occasions. I show my age, but I recommend the Whitmore Hall these days. But I'll sum up then with some ways of thinking. Here's a quip. Do you ever get that urge, Frank? There you are at the top of scaffolding. I've made you all feel gloomy, I hope, about life and how we are intermeshed in all the suffering. It begins with looking down from 50 stories up, thinking about the meaninglessness of life, listening to dark voices inside you and think, should I push someone else off? That's humanity. But thinking in general then, Wittgenstein urges, he expressly says, when two philosophers meet, they should say to each other, take your time. Obviously, I've rushed through lots of topics this evening, but I think it's very valuable if you want to think about philosophy, you want to think about reality and so forth, take your time. I said at the beginning, don't rush into quick decisions, reflect. He also spoke in terms of the craving for generality. Wittgenstein supported the Shakespeare comment, I teach you differences. There are many, many differences, and it's wrong to say, oh, all of that's wrong or all of that's right. Look at shades of grey, so to speak. And you'd always also say, people always ask for the meaning of words, but actually look at how words get used and what people do with those words. Another philosopher I particularly like, around the same time as Wittgenstein thought he was moronic, which was appropriate. This is called G.E. Moore. But later on, Wittgenstein realized that G.E. Moore was a very, very important philosopher. Moore was then a young man, and an older philosopher there at Trinity College, Cambridge, said that time is unreal. To which Moore said, "Are you really telling me, Jack, that I didn't have my breakfast before I had my lunch?" Do remember that simple example. When you read any philosophy, or indeed any other subject, try to pin them down. Exactly what do they mean? If somebody says time is unreal, presume they don't really mean that you didn't have your breakfast before you had your lunch. So pin it down to common sense. That's a G.E. Moore line, huge line, to remind you about what's going on with interpretation and language. Taxi, you're calling a taxi. Oh, in return, pedestrian. You need to understand how language is being used. And here's another valuable lesson from Professor G.E. Moore, the elderly boy. He was then very elderly indeed. I sort of like a sage. People had to respect G.E. Moore. And he was often criticized for sitting in seminars saying nothing, which he said, "But I didn't want to be silent. I couldn't think of anything to say." That's another valuable thought. We know politicians, they always have to answer straight away, or pretend to answer straight away. Just recognize, oh, perhaps I've got nothing to say of this. I need to think about it. Take your time. And as I stress, humility. With humility, therefore, you might think that before you judge a man or woman, this is old-fashioned terminology, a man, before you judge a man, people have said, you must walk a mile in his shoes so you can see what sort of life he's suffering. And of course, if you judge him severely, we may add, at least you're a mile ahead, and he's got no shoes. So that's the human condition. Do you have something for the human condition? You can see I'm rather gloomy about the human condition, but at my time of life, it's not really so important because I don't have so many years left on average, I trust. And so I tend to go along with Samuel Beckett here, as I mentioned, another philosopher in my book. One sunny day, he was heading to Lord's for the cricket. Beckett enjoys the blue sky, the trees swaying. This is reported by a friend. And the friend says, "Yes, Sam, it's good to be alive, isn't it, Beckett?" I wouldn't go as far as that. I have sympathy with that. And so there's an advert for the book, written by a friend of mine, so I still owe him the £8.50 for the day. But thanks a lot for listening to this, and I'll take any questions.
When you have a seat, I will rearrange a couple of things so the online audience can see you. My lovely assistant, Brian, is gathering the microphone.
Lovely assistant. Wow.
All my assistants are lovely.
What happened to Martha?
Both of them. We'll just move this over here. So people can hear you. And while the audience gathers their questions, you mentioned the famous quote from Socrates, or now Socrates, that the unexamined life is not worth living. And I can't remember who said it, but one response to that is that the examined life isn't much comp either. And you seem to be exploring some of the more pessimistic as well as the optimistic philosophers. Which ones do you relate to more, and why?
Well, this is on, by the way.
It is, yeah. I should talk right into it.
I did show on one of my slides John Stuart Mill, but I didn't comment about his point that it's better to be a dissatisfied Socrates than a satisfied pig. I'd always have something to be said for the pig for part of our lives. I don't think it's all black or white. As I was saying earlier on, I do believe that lots of these things have gradations and grayness in different contexts. And so, yes, at times it's wonderful to lead the piggish life, to drink too much and so forth, but then the next day you feel rather unhappy about what you were up to. So in the end, I do think the examined life is something which you need to be engaging, but that doesn't mean you need to be engaging and examining every moment of the day. It's a matter of degree and a matter of context. But in as far as Nick has asked me which way I tend to go, as you will have already picked up, I tend to be rather pessimistic, because the worst that happens is I prove wrong about the future, whereas being pessimistic, normally I prove right. I tend to think things will always get worse, and when people say, oh, don't be so gloomy, I bump into them 2 or 3 years later and say, oh, you're right, things got worse. But of course, I may one day be wrong.
Do we have a few questions from the audience? Any philosophers you would like to know a little bit more about?
Well, if you want to know about some philosophers, I wouldn't come to me. I'd read a good book about them. Yeah, thank you.
We have one at the front, and then 2 at the back after.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. How do you cope with something which is very indeterminate? Like a lot of physicists and astronomers believe there was a Big Bang 5, whatever it was, years ago. And the evidence points one way and the other way, and yet it seems unbelievable. How does your philosophy try to deal with that issue? Was there a Big Bang?
I was about to say I suppose, but I'm not sure why I say I suppose. My position on that is quite clear. Whatever do they mean by a Big Bang at the beginning? Because when you speak to the more erudite ones, they say, oh, no, you mustn't think of it as being at the beginning of anything. And so then we need to start examining quite what is it that they mean. When these scientists, they often associate that with the theory of everything. And then you think, well, what constitutes a theory of everything? What would count as a theory of everything? They mention lots of laws of nature and so on. People can still say, well, how come there's a universe with those laws of nature? If they are going to talk about a Big Bang as being at the beginning of time, then what sense can you make of the beginning of time? So my point is probably a point of ignorance, is that I want them to explain in more detail, in Moore's terms, in common sense language, about what they mean. I know they often say, oh, well, time is some sort of subjectivity associated with human beings, but nonetheless, all their theories which they announce they have got from looking at screens and looking at evidences and talking about rays of light and so forth, and then they go off to have their dinner. So they clearly do have a concept of time which they use in day by day. I think, therefore, they need to be explaining how their theories relate to our everyday concepts. My suspicion is that this is a plea of the ignorant on my part, but I think it's an important plea that we ought not to be taken in by these terms. Who knows how these things will work out, but explain them in everyday language. I'm sure I haven't answered your question, by the way, but then I am a philosopher.
Thank you. We had a couple of questions up at the back, Brian, if you can raise that. Maybe we'll take a couple, one after the other, and Peter, you can ponder them.
You think I can add up 1 or 2?
Working? Yes, it is. Thank you for a most interesting run through philosophy and history. And I just have a question. You started off with philosophy. Finds exist or don't exist by in the future or the past, and actually it's just about the present. One piece in all of the philosophers, not in your presentation, that I'm interested to understand possibly their interpretation is, what about love and humanity? And that is something that carries on. So loved ones who die or whatever, it's so important to the existence of our well-being and our consciousness of family and just our existence. We aren't all individual beings that just exist like robots. How does that contextualize into that kind of philosophy? How do we deal with that?
Well, I wondered to what extent I made my position clear. My position was pointing out there is a genuine problem about how we can talk about items which do not exist. But I follow the common sense line. Obviously, we do talk about items that do not exist, mainly past relatives and so on who have died. And also, I see that's very important to many people about how we do relate to each other. Hence, I gave that particular example about somebody who's now dead. Even if you don't believe in an afterlife, you might still be believing that it's wrong to start ruining their reputation, to start kicking their corpse around. Not purely because it will upset their relatives, but because it will be wrong for that deceased individual. My position is more that it's difficult to understand what's going on in our relationship to these non-existents, but it's not to deny that we do have that relationship. I'm just baffled by how it works, but more I'm pointing out how Parmenides and many other philosophers are baffled about how it works. But that it does work is important. And I take as very important your point about the community being part of the group. And that's why I'd stress reading Simone Weil, who very much is stressing the idea that we are part of the humanity, and therefore we are engaged in self-deception when we keep on cutting ourselves off on what is really happening in other parts of the world. Karl Marx, another philosopher I deal with, tells of a story about Perseus who sort of keep his cap pulled down over his eyes so he couldn't see the monsters. And Marx is, of course, alluding to the fact that so many of us, including me, much of the time, we have our cap pulled down, not prepared to see how dreadful the world is for so many millions of people. Both in Barnes, well, not millions in Barnes, a few people in Barnes, but millions if you go around the world in general. I started to get distracted again about Barnes railway signs, so I mustn't do that.
We'll move on quickly to the next question.
So I do, just to some way, I do encourage the idea all things conspire, that we are part of the greater whole, and therefore we ought to not keep on deceiving ourselves, saying, oh, I can't be bothered, or it doesn't matter. We are all wearing clothes or having mobile phones, which have relied on huge amounts of suffering of other human beings, and indeed non-human animals. Hence I'm gloomy. Hence better not to be born, said Sophocles.
Let's take the other question at the back.
Lovely, great run through philosophy. I think you might have missed somebody. Yeah.
Surely not.
Yeah. Donald Rumsfeld.
Ah, a great man.
With his known, unknown. So
Yes.
he was lampooned for that, obviously.
But
I find it pretty profound. I don't know what you think.
when he said that, the philosophers I know, we all agree that's about the only true thing he ever said. Namely, that there are unknown unknowns and so forth. So we were quite impressed with that. But obviously we weren't impressed with him in general. We should also make a distinction between the person and the person's views. And I think in the case of Rumsfeld, both the person and the person's views seem pretty obnoxious. But I mean, there are other cases in which you may think the views are obscene, but the person is a nice guy or a nice woman, or the other way around. But the person may in fact be a nasty bit of work, but they may actually say something which is true and useful.
The teller and the tale.
Interesting way of putting it, yes.
We had a couple of questions in the second row.
How do you count your rows?
I'm sorry, I'm not counting, very rudely not counting you.
It's not complicated.
Thank you very much for a really entertaining talk. Here's my question. You have a collection of 30 philosophers in your book, and they're very different approaches and conclusions. But my question is, what is a common thread between them? That, in contrast, for instance, to a collection of 30 scientists or 30 novelists or 30 politicians, what is the thing that brings them together, even though there's a difference in their approaches?
Sadly, that's a very good question. I think one way of answering is that if you are a scientist, then although not exclusively, to a large extent, you'll be engaged in empirical research, you'll be engaged in experimentation or in other subjects, looking at the experiences. Whereas these philosophers, with a few exceptions, are not so much doing that. They are very much reasoning on the basis of what we all know about or think about, right, on the basis of their humanity. And also they are typically, though there's the odd exception, doing it in a relatively rigorous way. So you might well say that a poet isn't normally doing it in a rigorous way, and that's why I'm stretching the idea of philosophy to include Sappho. But typically, the typical philosopher as such will actually have some sort of argument structure going ahead. Unless you meet Heidegger, who I felt obliged to include, I did call him a hyphenator. And at the end of each chapter, I meant to say how to think like Descartes, how to think like Leibniz, how to think like Heidegger. I did say, dare I say, I wish you didn't. But some of you may approve of Heidegger, and many people think he's a great philosopher. I still don't quite know why, but he's very good on hyphens. I call him the great hyphenator. And what's interesting about Heidegger is he, as some of you know, it does seem to be well established, and he's very, very anti-Semitic. Yet one of his early girlfriends was Hannah Arendt. I also have a chapter on who was very, very Jewish. And even when it came out about how much he supported the Nazi party, much later in life, she still nipped over to Germany to keep on their friendship. So that's quite an interesting relationship. Again, showing how relationships between human beings can extend beyond or not be affected by beliefs of those human beings. Often they do affect each other, but I don't think necessarily they do.
Did we have a question over here on the side?
In government, we have a chief scientific officer, chief nursing officer, chief medical officer. Should there be a chief philosophical officer?
That's a nice idea. Some years ago, and it's even more so now, corporations did start having ethicists on their board. A friend of mine many years ago was very, very pleased because at that time it seemed a lot of money. He's suddenly being offered £500 to be the ethics consultant to, I think it was BP, but I'm not sure. The post didn't last that long. But as you know, in this current government, you are meant to have an ethics commissioner. Is that what do they call them? Some individual who got reappointed?
Independent advisor on ethics.
Yes. So that's the nearest you get. I think you want in the government, which to my mind is really obviously we don't have at the moment, decent people, people who are concerned about others. Now, and I certainly don't see that amongst many of the ministers, but you're just trying to engage me in politics. And maybe I'll stop people even thinking of buying my book. By the way, someone, I think Nick said, so we hope you'll consider buying the book. No, I don't want you to consider it. How much rather you buy it? You don't even have to read it. Many years ago, I wrote a book on humanism, which was, people said, well, it would upset those Christians and Muslims and so forth. Which my point was, I don't mind if they burn my books, as long as they buy them first. But I'm not going to become a wealthy man from authorship, so don't worry about that. It doesn't matter.
So buy the book, then think.
And take your time and think. Of the things I've commented on, the points I would like to emphasize yet again is Wittgenstein's comment. Take your time when you think about these things. And don't think there must be a general answer. There's bits and pieces. That's why I talk about it as muddling through and pin people down in everyday language. So,
one of the topics you returned to a couple of times was this idea of harming dead people, harming people who no longer exist. And one of the few philosophical problems you didn't touch on in your talk was the one of personal identity, from Locke and through Parfit and so on. What actually is a person? And is that a debate you found in any way interesting, and where did you come down on that one?
You think I come down on these things? I did skip through a slide in which I did say about David Hume raises the issue about the I, what is the self? And as you've already mentioned, John Locke raised that issue, and Hume carried on with that view about what is the self other than a sequence of perceptions, a sequence of feelings and memories and so forth. And Derek Parfit, who died recently, as you know, there's a wonderful book out about his life, very, very detailed, mind you, was basically Humean in that view. That the best way you can understand a person's identity is as a sequence of experiences or memories and perceptions and so forth. There's no one linking I behind it all. And a philosopher who, as I mentioned, is more of a novelist, Iris Murdoch, she would write about the unselfing of the self. So she gives an example in which there you see you might be so concerned about yourself, you've been slighted over something, or you failed to get that publication right or such. And then her example is you suddenly look out of the window and you see a kestrel flying across the sky. and that sort of takes you away from yourself and into the beauty of the world around you. And that's a very romantic idea, but there's some truth in that. That's why I, following Schopenhauer, would say, despite all these troubles, you can lose yourself in music. Another example I mentioned. In reply to your question, therefore, I think the notion of the self is a contradictory notion, or it's very difficult to get a grip on it. But we all make use of it day by day and so forth. But in a sense, you're probably at best with yourself when you're no longer aware of yourself, but you are engaged in playing the piano or trying to play the piano, or you're engaged in listening to Schubert, or as I put the Pet Shop Boys, or you're looking at the Kestrel out there. And that's the extent to which I have great sympathy for the much mocked Plato, and indeed G.E. Moore, for the idea that you can lift yourself out of this world, speaking metaphorically, and lose yourself in things of beauty. I use the term beauty very loosely, especially if you're trying to listen to my piano playing. So that's the idea. That does remind me of Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was the philosopher of pessimism, as you may know, to which I'm getting the right way around. Nietzsche said, what? He can't possibly be a philosopher of pessimism. He had all these dinner parties and he played the flute, which I said, you don't know how badly he played it. Right, I've forgotten the question. I am allowed to forget things, as I said, I forget most things, and that's a great benefit too.
Do we have more questions from the audience? We have
hands.
We have hands at least. A hand at the back, and then one at the front afterwards.
Your hand reminded me of a great lecture given by G.E. Moore, who I mentioned so often now already. And he proved the existence of the external world. It was called Proof of the Existence of the External World. And basically, it consisted of his holding out his hand and saying, here is a hand, here is another hand, therefore I prove the existence of the external world. And philosophers after that, whether anguish, was he being moronic? Was it being stupid? Or is there something very profound here? Or is it the nature of proof? And it's been a very fertile lecture, even on the surface, it seems so minor. But I distract you, sir. Go ahead.
Yes, Professor, in the course of the presentation, you mentioned about the impossibility or difficulty of talking about something based on existing.
Yes.
And, I mean, that reminds me about Bertrand Russell's formula to talk about the present king of France is full. His explanation, as far as I know, is to say you can translate that sentence, the present king of France is full, by saying that there is an X, such that X is the present king of France, and X is full. Do you agree with his reformulation of this sentence?
This gentleman is showing his erudition with regard to Bertrand Russell. And yes, Bertrand Russell produced what is called the theory of definite descriptions and the theory of descriptions. It was in an article in, I believe, Mine 1905. You can see I used to be involved in this a lot. I used to write a lot on it. And the editor of the Mind at that time said to Bertrand Russell, are you really sure you want this article published? It's garbage, isn't it? To which Russell insisted. And it became what Frank Ramsey, another important philosopher of that time, though he died very young, called it the paradigm of philosophy. And so you're perfectly right. When we talk about the King of France, as the gentleman is saying, that is a non-existent entity, because at that time there wasn't a King of France. So the present King of France is bald. Russell argued that's false, because it's saying that there is an X such that X rules over France, and only one X rules over France, blah, blah, blah. And so he does do a translation in that way. How that translation is going to work, though, with things of the past and things of the future, that's a different point. He doesn't manage to do that for past and future things, other than to accept that we do talk about items of the past and items of the future. Remember, to say there is an X, you still now talk pointing to something. But yes, I agree with Russell. Strawson, who was at Oxford at the time, some many years later, dismissed the theory of descriptions as a rubbish, and he wrote long articles against it and so forth. And another philosopher at that time, we're now talking about the 1960s, was Casimir Louis at Cambridge. And Louis had a very low opinion of Strawson. I attended some of his lectures, and Louis only a few. But Louis gave many lectures geared to vixen means female fox, or vixen is a female fox. You know, many detailed versions. There's a book published by him which goes on about vixen and female fox. And in one of his lectures, he would famously say, he always gave the same lecture more or less. For many years, he'd say, "Oh yes, I'm Mr. Strawson of Oxford," would say this. He was very Polish, Casimir Louis. That was a poor Polish accent. And then later on in his lectures, he had to say, "Oh, Mr. Strawson, oh, I'm terribly sorry, I mean Professor Strawson. Now, why he should be a professor, I do not know." That sort of comment. So it reminds me of that. But then it reminds me of lots of Casimir Louis. Another philosopher then at Cambridge was Richard Braithwaite, who published a book on scientific explanation. And one of the students said to Louis, "Well, so what do you think about Professor Braithwaite's latest book?" Which Louis said, "Oh, it's published on fine paper." To which that story was told to somebody else in my presence a few years ago at a sort of get together. And the man then said, "Oh, so what did Louis really think about that book?" To which my friend said, "But we just told you." You need to think it through. Sorry, I digress, but that's the way I get through life, to digress.
We had a question on your left, Brian.
I would like to make one further point. I do digress, I do tell little stories, but I think that's a useful thing for some people in order to enjoy philosophy, namely to recognize that these are individual people with their own foibles, and it's also a way of reminding yourself about issues. And I suspect many of you will go away remembering, so did I have my breakfast before I had my dinner? Oh, that's only out eating more when McTaggart saying time was unreal.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk. I don't have any jokes, but I would find.
Of course, that may be a joke. So
well,
I don't have any jokes. In fact, most things could be jokes.
I always find philosophy is difficult to define.
Good.
I
Beware of
mean,
definition.
ostensibly, it translates as love of wisdom.
Yes,
I think it's a little bit presuming to label yourself as wise. So I wonder whether I might try. The philosophy is actually meeting of minds, or the attempt at meeting of minds. Would you agree with that?
Or it might be the unmeeting of minds.
It might be.
But you make a point which I should have made, namely, many of us are committed to the idea, which goes back to Socrates and Plato again, that the best way of engaging in philosophy is in face-to-face discussion. Sorry.
No. I mean, would you say that the Socratic method, where you have two people, well, Socrates is the mentor, yes, but that kind of dialogue, could that be repeated in schools in some way?
Well, the problem is back to funding and number of people around. But to go back to that point, Plato expressly explains how it is that in a dialogue face to face, or even I suppose over the internet, where you can see the expressions on people's faces, you can pick up quite what haven't you explained clearly, or how you've gone wrong, or whether they're misunderstanding by the way they're scowling at you and so forth. That interrelationship between people, Plato would argue, and I tend to agree with him, is very important in engaging in philosophy. And hence, although Plato wrote all these dialogues, the best you can think that he was doing is that he was trying to remind us of the importance of having dialogue face to face. And as I'm sure many of you know, for many, it still happens a little bit in Oxford and London, but for many years in philosophy tutorials, it would be the philosophy professor or supervisor or tutor on a 1 or 1-to-2 relationship discussing a topic. Whereas in more recent decades, because of funding and more numbers and so on, much of the philosophy is even in the lecture room to 100 people. Whereas that is going to be so different, isn't it, from in fact having a face-to-face discussion with somebody in which one of them actually knows more about the information. But over my many years of teaching just at the Open University, I don't mean just to dismiss the university, but I learned a lot from my students because I just literally said things and somebody would make a puncturing remark such as Paul would, therefore Fletcher here would, I'll make you think, oh, that doesn't quite work out. Yes, he's right, I'm wrong. Back to the humility point.
I was
Oh, I must cut you off, I'm afraid, just in case there are any more questions before we end. We can go into full Socratic discussion in a couple of minutes.
Full Socratic discussion.
Can I ask Sean?
Go on, Brian. Last question to you.
Slightly far.
Yeah, that was the first question. Can you ask the question? And this is going to be a second question.
Is there any truth to the story you were alluding to, the atheism of David Hume? That when Boswell was there at the very last, he asked him, "Will you not now renounce the devil and all his pomps?" And Hume was said to reply, "Now is not the time to be making enemies." Is that apocryphal or is that?
I really don't know. I mean, I know that quip, but I don't know if it was really said. But one does admire David Hume. For those of you who don't read much philosophy, a philosopher of that era to read is indeed David Hume. His essays are easy to read relatively, and they are something which you can enjoy. Essay on miracle, on tragedy, and on suicide, and so on. So he's a great guy. Most people in Britain these days, most philosophers, they strongly approve of David Hume. Some of us disapprove of, say, John Locke, because he wrote so much. I remember having to teach John Locke, not teach John Locke, but teach John Locke. And I could have tried teaching John Locke, and even the abridged edition of the essay struck me as so tedious and dreadful. Whereas Hume, he wrote in a light and enjoyable style. And I find that of the aphorisms of the later Wittgenstein, so I would encourage you to do that. A philosopher, little known, but I still strongly approve of, again, at the Wittgensteinian time, is a philosopher called, with the wonderful name, John Wisdom. And so look out for John Wisdom and some of his odd little articles. But he was a good guy. You can see I recommend some. As I don't recommend Peter Strauss, though in fact he sort of great guy. And Derek Parfit, not all of it too much. But you know more about Parfit than I do.
It was going to be my last question. If people are thinking about a great philosopher to start with, where would you point them? You said Hume. Are there others that you particularly suggest?
There's so many, and of course it does depend what would particularly grab you. I still think the early dialogues of Plato, which are often marketed as the last days of Socrates, in which we have 2 or 3 little dialogues, and we normally include the apology by Socrates, which is his speech just before when he was being tried, in which he was sort of apologizing what he had done. In fact, it wasn't an apology at all. He didn't even say, "I apologize." He wasn't like a politician who says, "I apologize," when they don't mean it. He actually said, "I've done such wonderful things for this city. I've sort of sparked you into thinking about these things. You should give me banquets and so forth instead of condemning me to death." But it's a nice piece written by Plato about Socrates. It's easily accessible. It's online. It's in lots of little collections. And it gives you a feeling for a philosopher living his life and trying to do his best for society. So as I said, it's got there's the Crito, the Phaedo, the Euthyphro, and the Apology. It's in most selections. So the last days of Socrates is a penguin title for it. So I strongly recommend that. If you want more modern examples, by modern we mean 16th, 17th century, how can one resist Descartes' meditations? They're still so important. They're classic work. And if you want more accessible, then the essays of David Hume are wonderful things. But most of it, I think one mistake many people make of philosophy is they think they must read it as a novel and read from the beginning to the end. I think the answer is not to do that, but to dip in. I'm very keen on the idea that you dip into philosophers. To read philosophy is a matter of dipping rather than going to start on page 1 and plough my way through. Do lots of dippings, and it may strike you as worthwhile to start back at the beginning and go all the way through, and to go back again. Take your time. Don't rush.
Thank you so much to Peter for coming and talking to us tonight.
There's one mistake I forgot to. The mistake was I forgot to mention. Ideally, to engage in philosophy, you need a glass of wine.
Well, we will be offering Peter a glass of wine afterwards, and a guided tour back to Barnes Station if
Yes.
desired. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm imagining that most of you are successfully signed up to the mailing list and getting the emails from the OSO. If you're not and you've just wandered in off the street by chance, you're also welcome. But you can sign up to our mailing list at osoarts.org.uk/philosophy club. And our next talk, I was trying to explain to one of our members how the timing works. I think it's the Tuesday of the second last full week of the month. So for those of you who short of time, 24th of October is the next one of those. So please come along to that. It's going to be lots of fun. We've got Kevin Barron, who's a former stand-up comedian, current philosopher, and he's talking about the philosophy of humour. So should be lots of fun. Please do book on our website. And if you'd like to stay for a drink and a further chat with Peter, you're very welcome. But please don't forget, buy his book Without Thinking, and then take your time afterwards if you would like to think some more. And thanks to all of you for coming.
Thank you.